Good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending today. My name is Jennifer Gray. I am the Public Services Coordinator for the Library and Lending Commons at FSCJ, and we are pleased to present to you today, It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine, ? Which is a panel discussion on different psychological aspects that may have become relevant in 2020. We are very happy to have with us today three of our fabulous psychology professors, Professor Benjamin Clark, Professor Nobuko Mizoguchi, and Professor Penny Devine. And I was going to go ahead and just let them take it away. So we'll be starting today with Professor Devine. Professor Devine, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Hi, I am Penny Devine, and today my topic is how does social psychology explain disparities in racial violence, police disparities in racial violence, a look at implicit biases. And so we all are acutely aware of the tragic killing on May 25th of this year of George Floyd. But some of us might not be aware that according to an analysis by CBS News, the U.S., in the United States, 164 Black people were killed in the first 8 months of 2020. And this slide to the right here is a slide that they prepared as part of this larger presentation looking at the individual case of each of these killings. This data also showed that at least one Black person was killed by the police every single week from January 1st to August 31st of this year. So yes, 2020 has been a rough year on many, many counts. Blacks are over 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than members of any other race. And basically, because this topic that I'm attempting to talk about today is so huge, I've decided to focus on one important part of the question regarding the community-police relations, specifically the disproportionate violence against Blacks in our society. Although social psych offers several important theoretical explanations for different aspects of this relationship, because of time limitations, today I'm going to focus my thoughts on the impact of implicit biases. Now, first, what are implicit biases? For our purposes today, we're going to look at several types of implicit racial biases, which are typically referred to as unconscious anti-Black bias in the form of negative stereotypes, which are beliefs, or attitudes, which are feelings that are widely held. I'll talk about 3 specific types: implicit white favoritism, implicit associations between Blacks and criminality, and then implicit dehumanization of Blacks. I'll try to do this quickly because there's so much to cover, but hopefully still. So this first type of implicit bias is implicit white favoritism, which is the automatic association of positive stereotypes and attitudes with members of a favored group, leading to preferential treatment for people who belong to that group. Now, whenever we talk about implicit biases, in general, we're talking about biases that are measured using an IAT or an implicit attitude test. Usually what happens is that people are asked to categorize 2 concepts with an attribute of some type. So, for example, they might be asked to make pairings between, let's say, Black and white and an attribute like intelligence. And so a faster response, or quote, easier response, indicates a stronger association between those 2 things. So if I have a stronger association between white and intelligent, that may be an indication of white favoritism. And research has shown that perceptions of whiteness actually leads to disassociations from criminal behavior and tends to protect whites from racial violence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. All right, next I have this implicit association between Blacks and criminalities. Research has also demonstrated an unconscious perceived association between Blacks and criminal behavior, and the existence of this unconscious association has led police officers to do multiple things like misidentify Blacks with more stereotypically Black features, such as darker skin, fuller lips, and wider noses as criminal suspects. So the more stereotypically Black someone appears, the more likely they are to be misidentified as a criminal. It has also led officers to engage in unconscious racial profiling and also to shoot more stereotypical looking Black suspects more quickly than other racial groups in computer simulations. Okay. And then the last type of implicit bias I want to mention here is the implicit dehumanization of Blacks. And so this refers to the tendency of individuals to unconsciously associate Blacks with apes. So in this measure, it's another IAT, or implicit attitude test. And what they did was they were asked to categorize association between blacks and whites, and then apes and great cats. And what we find are some interesting patterns among people who have a stronger association with blacks and apes, which the authors of this article, Goff and Jackson, categorized as, as a higher dehumanization of blacks. And so we'll come back to that as well. All right, so let's just jump right into talking about this study by Goff and Jackson. In this study, they looked at perceptions of innocence of children from different racial groups and then what the implications for that were in terms of culpability for crimes. Children are generally viewed as innocent and in need of our protection. And so in this study, what they did was they constructed a scale to measure innocence after pretesting. And so they use characteristics like, how much does a child from this age group need protection? How much do they need care? How well can they care for themselves? How much are, to reverse code it, how much are they a danger to others? How cute are they? How innocent are they, etc. And they used the responses on these items to come up with a measure of innocence. And if you look at the data here, what you see is that up until about the age 9, there's not a significant difference between ratings of innocence for children who are white, black, or belong to the race unspecified group. So from 0 to 4, you see ratings of about 6.19, 6.15, and 6.05. Similarly, for ages 5 through 9, children from all three categories were rated relatively similar in their innocence levels. But something happens at age 10 where African American children are no longer perceived as being innocent or in need of protection. And so their ratings drop to 3.31 relative to 4.5 or 4.39 for white and race unspecified children. And so obviously that's a pretty significant thing that we start to view Black children as not innocent and potentially culpable for crimes after 9 years of age. Now, in the second study, what they looked at was a variety of scenarios, 8 different scenarios, and participants looked at 8 scenarios where a photograph of a child who was either Black, white, or Latino was paired with a statement of a crime. So here, the example I have is Kashawn Tompkins was arrested and charged with cruelty to animals. He attempted to drown a neighborhood cat in his backyard. So that's one example. There are a number of different misdemeanors and felonies that were included in the statements. And they changed both the photograph and the name of the child to be either Black, white, or Latino. Participants were asked to do a couple different things. The first is to make those age estimates. And then they calculated overestimations. And then they were also supposed to make judgments of culpability. So how responsible is this child for his actions? How much can he care for himself? How likely is he to persist in these negative behaviors? And how likely is it that he did not intend the negative consequences of his actions? And then this just shows you the types of crimes that they use. So for misdemeanors, they use cruelty to animals, possession of drug paraphernalia, malicious destruction of property, shoplifting, possession of stolen property. You get the idea. For felonies, it was arson, breaking and entering, aggravated assault, intent to distribute narcotics, rape, or armed carjacking. So those were the crimes that were used in the different scenarios. Now, what you find here is that the students overestimated the ages of Blacks by an average of 4.5 years relative to whites and Latinos. I mean, all right, so just let me give you an example. So if a white 12-year-old was accused of a felony, if you look here, they actually experience an underestimation of age. So people on average thought that they were around 11 years old, whereas a Black child who was 12 years old was more likely to be judged at being almost 17 years of age. Given that we know that these estimates of age or that their perceptions of being a certain age are closely linked to their perceptions of innocence, that's really important. Additionally, if you look at the graph on the right, what we see is that definitely for felonies, that we see higher ratings of culpability for our African American children as well. So Oh, and one other finding there, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but they also did a measurement of the perceptions of dehumanization of Blacks. And they find that participants who implicitly associated Blacks with apes, like I mentioned before, tended to overestimate age and culpability for Black children consistently, where they did not for the other racial groups. So. All right, and then study 3. In study 3, they this is the last study in the Goff and Jackson study. They decided to look at use of force, and so for use of force, things like takedowns, wrist locks, kicking, punching, striking with a blunt object, using a police dog, restraints, hobbling, tear gas, electric shock, or killing. So these are the behaviors that they're looking for, and what this graph shows is the mean number of use of force incidents per officer with children who are white, Black, or Latino. You can see a significantly higher, mean number for, Black children who experienced about 2.2 incidents relative to about half for whites and for Latinos as well. Black children experience use of force about 2.2 times more relative to the other groups. And interestingly, they also looked at dehumanization here, and they found that the more closely police officers unconsciously associated Black youth with apes, the more likely they were to have used force against Black children throughout their careers. And it's also interesting that overt expressions of prejudice aren't associated with use of force, but their unconscious dehumanization of Blacks was. So that's, something interesting that should probably be looked at further as well. And then just to look at this, implicit dehumanization of Blacks, remember, refers to the tendency of individuals to unconsciously associate Blacks with apes. Recent studies showed that implicit dehumanization predicts police violence against Black juveniles. When participants were subliminally primed with images of apes, they were more likely to find a vicious beating of a Black suspect to be justified, where similar effects did not occur when the victim of the beating was white or when individuals were not primed with images of apes. So then, in conclusion, and I know this has been a lot of information, implicit biases impact police behaviors in a way that increases the likelihood of violence against Blacks relative to other racial groups, and implicit biases affects whites in a way that often protects them from violence. Remember the underestimation of age for felonies. So Richardson suggests that an important strategy in reducing implicit biases is to transform current policing strategies and cultures that create an us versus them mentality between officers and the non-white communities they police, and to increase positive intergroup contact, for example, community policing. In contrast, in 2020, we've seen this huge cry to defund the police, which means a variety of things depending on who you ask. But across the board, it tends to mean a shift in the role of policing in our society. For example, maybe reducing some of the tasks by involving mental health experts, for example, to be involved in situations where we may be talking about people who have those special needs. And that is it for me.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Devine. While Professor Clark gets his slides loaded up, I'm going to chill for a minute here and remind everybody that we do have you on mute in deference to our presenters. But if you have questions, we will be doing a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions for our presenters as they go along, please be sure to put them in the chat for me, and we will address them at the end. And now it looks like Professor Clark has his slides ready, so I will segue back over to him. Professor Clark, take it away.
All right, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Devine. That was fascinating. As I've been kind of reflecting on 2020 and what all has happened this year, it is for sure overwhelming. But one thing that comes to mind for me, at least in my research, my background, is social relationships and the quality of social relationships. And so it's fascinating to see our social dynamics and how they're evolving right now. In some unexpected ways, some of them somewhat expected. But as I've reflected on this year, my thoughts have turned to those who find themselves socially isolated, or at least feeling lonely. So a couple years ago, in 2018, Cigna, one of the most well-known insurance companies in the U.S., conducted a large national survey, and it included about 10,000, more than 10,000 individuals age 18 and over in continental U.S., Alaska, Hawaii. And this study used what's known as the UCLA loneliness scale. It's a widely used academic measure for loneliness. And what was found in 2019, the results showed that approximately 3 in 5 Americans, according to this study, so roughly 60% or so, report feeling lonely, compared to 2018, and that number was right around 50%. So just in that 2-year time frame, we saw an increase. I can only imagine what 2020 is going to look like. Again, I'm not sure we have that data or enough robust data to really understand that. But it is clear that there are cases of isolation. There are certain populations that are especially vulnerable to that. Just going back to that survey, though, younger generations, interestingly, reported greater loneliness than older generations. Nearly 8 in 10 Gen Zers, so born in the mid to late 90s to the early 2010s or so, nearly 8 in 10, so that's 80% almost. And then about 7 in 10 millennials also reported high levels of loneliness, compared to the boomers, about half, so about 50%. So we do see some interesting differences between generations potentially, but again, older individuals who are isolated when in nursing homes or care facilities, this can be an issue, especially this year. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Some other interesting findings: men were reporting higher levels of loneliness than women. The difference there was statistically significant, but not. It was a 1-point difference on the scale, which it may not look like a huge difference. Those living in urban areas and suburban areas reported lower levels of loneliness than those in rural areas. This, again, it's a fascinating survey, and so this got me thinking of what's changed. What's changed from 2018 to 2019, and now in 2020. We have many obstacles to connection in 2020. Obviously, social distancing, or literally adding space, at least 6 feet of space between people, and that does change the social norms, right? Sometimes when we have a close relationship with somebody, when we communicate with them, we communicate a little closer. Masks. We can't see people's entire face and read some of those nonverbal cues. We have quarantining when sick or at risk for becoming sick. Again, I think about those individuals who are in care facilities who are largely affected by this. We have canceled or restricted events all over. Concerts, movies, religious gatherings, schools for some, weddings, sporting events, and you name it, family and friend gatherings. We're coming up on the holidays, and there's discussion about that, right? We have a larger number of people working from home. A lot of people get their social interactions in the workplace. We're coming out of an election cycle, and clearly there are polarized attitudes, meaning whether it's politics or social issues or how to approach the pandemic, of whether we gather or we not gather. These differing opinions have the potential to divide us, and so we see some polarization there. We have an increased use of digitally mediated communication. I mean, we're doing this event right now over WebEx. We've never done that before. We're usually in person, and so not being able to see everybody in the room and see their faces, that changes the dynamic for me. It's difficult as I meet with my classes every single week, not to see your faces and be able to read the room. And so that's certainly a barrier. And then some individuals just out of practice. I mean, if you've been stuck at home for months on end and haven't interacted a lot, you may be out of practice with just common socially accepted behaviors. and just generally may struggle with social skills. And so those are all potential obstacles. I'm sure you all could probably add more to this list. So these are just a few that came to mind. Yes, Penny, I miss concerts too. So I wanted to talk about not only these unique features of 2020 and what's leading to loneliness and social isolation, but what are the impacts and what does the research tell us about the impact of loneliness and social isolation on physical or mental health? Now, to be clear on these terms, isolation is being removed from the physical presence of others. Loneliness, on the other hand, is the perceived lack of connection with others. And so you can have both of those things. You can be socially isolated and feel lonely, but you can feel lonely and not be socially isolated. You can have people around you and just not feel connected to them. And so that's an important distinction. But in either case, there are some very real, very important implications that we need to think about. So what does the research tell us? There are clear associations between loneliness and physical and mental health states. For example, loneliness not only involves obviously the painful feelings of isolation, disconnectedness from others, and not belonging, but it also is a risk factor for several health conditions. For instance, we see increased cardiovascular resistance in young adults who report high levels of loneliness or social isolation, elevated systolic blood pressure in older adults, less restorative sleep. We see increased endocrine response related to stress when people report elevated levels of loneliness. We also see interesting things with the immune system. And again, my colleagues could say, and probably understand this maybe even better than I do, but elevated levels of stress hormone can weaken immune system functioning. And so that is, that's not a good thing, certainly during a pandemic, to reduce our immune system functioning. Additionally, longitudinal analysis, so when we study individuals over time, it reveals that adults who are socially isolated as children are more likely to have risk factors for cardiovascular disease, including more overweight issues, high blood pressure, increased levels of total cholesterol, all kinds of health measures, right? So these have very real implications on physical health. Additionally, with mental health, lonely people are more likely to suffer from cognitive decline. And when diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, for example, we see greater progression or worsening of symptoms when socially isolated and or lonely. Loneliness also impairs executive functioning, and so executive functioning is goal-directed behavior. And in part, that is it triggers it basically triggers hypervigilance for social threats when we're isolated and feeling lonely. And heightened sensitivity to social threats can result in cognitions subtly, but also can influence our social behaviors when we are feeling threatened in that way. So loneliness, obviously not a good thing. It's been shown to lead to depressive symptoms. We see increased rates of suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts. So clearly a problem, right? So I guess the question is, why are we seeing this? Why is it so detrimental to our health? I mean, I'll even tell you that some have compared social isolation and loneliness to the negative effects of smoking. It can have that significant of an effect on your health. So why is that the case? Why do we need this kind of social connection? We can look at evolution or biological theories. Social connections are key for safety and survival. In many cases, it's adaptive to help each other, to group together for protection, to pool resources. Some research suggests genetic links to a variety of social behaviors, really, and thoughts. We also know that the reward pathways in the brain respond when we interact with people who are predictably positive and supportive. And I say predictably, that is important because we all interact with people who are somewhat unpredictable. And in those cases, that can cause even elevated stress, and that's not good for us either. So evolution, biology can cue us in on some of that. Early attachments are another explanation. We, from a very early age, form attachments with our caregivers, our family members, friends, and we form those attachments with those who are meeting our needs, whether they be need for food or safety or emotional needs. So those ingredients are the stage is set early on. We also, and this is kind of my area of research in the past, is social support. Social support is having people you can turn to when you need something or when you're in crisis. And again, there's a lot of ways we do that. There's emotional social support if you need empathy or love or trust. Who do you talk to when you have a bad day? That's your emotional social support. Instrumental social support is tangible aid and assistance and service, such as having someone help you move or change a tire or give you cash. I mean, that's tangible. Informational social support. This is someone who can give you advice, suggestions, information. For me, I think of parenting. I know who I can turn to when I have a parenting concern. I know who to ask. I know who not to ask as well. And then appraisal. Appraisal has more to do with self-evaluation. So in other words, social comparisons can obviously be a good thing to kind of gauge where we are, but also could be detrimental if we're comparing ourselves to unrealistic expectations. So, but in any case, social support, it's critical. This is what we're looking for. So how do we find and foster meaningful connections in 2020 and beyond? What are some ways that we can try and find those meaningful connections if we are lacking them? So a few things have emerged in the research. So the first two probably will help most with isolation more than loneliness. So enhancing your social support network. In other words, look for ways to do that. I like to use the phrase cast a net or cast a wider net. If you don't have enough friends, you gotta go fishing. You gotta look. Join a meetup, join a Facebook group. Look for various groups in your community. The point is we have to reach out. You may even reach out to people you haven't talked to in a while. Another thing here, take opportunities for social interactions, the ones that already exist. If there is an event such as this or otherwise, you can join those things and form connections in that way. Find groups where you have shared interests and hobbies, volunteer, study groups. If you're going to school, that's not a bad idea. These next two, improve social skills and addressing maladaptive social cognitions, this is probably going to help more with loneliness. So working on social skills would be trying to improve your listening abilities, asking questions, validating others when appropriate. Not trying to win a conversation. If you're talking politics at Thanksgiving, not trying to win the conversation, but trying to understand other people's perspectives. Learning how to handle periods of silence, nonverbal communication, that kind of thing. And then maladaptive social cognitions. This is sometimes better addressed with a therapist, but it can be helpful here because it can sometimes be difficult to understand or identify our own problematic attributions or biases or self-defeating thoughts or behaviors. So, in conclusion, moving forward, I would encourage all of us, if we are lacking social connection or meaningful connection, if we feel lonely, set a goal to reach out to somebody, have a quality conversation, reach out to someone you haven't talked to in a while. If you feel a little guilty about that, as I do, when I haven't talked to someone in a year or two, they haven't called you either. So, you can be the person to do that. Attend or organize a digital or in-person event, obviously following CDC guidelines for safety. If you find yourself experiencing depressive symptoms or anxiety, talk to a doctor or a therapist. We also have a student assistance or employee assistance programs at the college. And then again, worst case scenario, if you're feeling socially isolated or lonely, again, it does potentially increase the risk for suicide. So reach out if you have help. I wanted to include that number here just in case anyone is in that situation. So I wish you all a better 2021 and healthy, happy social relationships.
All right. Thank you, Professor Clark. I will give Professor Mizoguchi just a minute to get her slides up and running now that you have completed your presentation. And I will remind everyone that we are going to close the event out after the presentations with the Q&A session. So if you do have a question for one or more than one of our presenters, please feel free to put it in the chat box and I will present it to them at the end. I do have you all muted out of deference to our speakers because we have all been in that WebEx where somebody forgets to mute their phone and then proceeds to eat lunch. It's never fun. All right, it looks like Professor Mizoguchi has her slides up and is ready to go, so I'll hand it over to you.
All right, everyone. 2020 has been a challenging year, to say the least, and some of it definitely has to do with racial tension, which I'm sure has been front of mind for many of us. So today I'm going to talk about racism, more specifically what scientists have to tell us about racism. If you are like me, you may have some friends who don't believe racism exists in our society. If you spend any time on social media, then you might have come across some videos or tweets in which somebody proclaims racism doesn't exist. Now, whether or not racism exists is not just a matter of opinion. It's actually an empirical question, meaning that we can scientifically examine whether it exists or not, and if so, to what extent. We can actually conduct a scientific experiment by manipulating an independent variable to see its effect on dependent variable, just as I do in any kind of scientific research. And here's how we do this. So in this particular experiment, researchers created 5,000 fictitious resumes and sent them out in response to help wanted ads in Boston and a Chicago newspaper ads. To manipulate the perceived race of an applicant, resumes are randomly assigned either Black-sounding names or white-sounding names. So this means that some applicants had Black-sounding names such as Jamal or Lakeisha, and other applicants had stereotypically white-sounding names such as Greg and Emily. And everything else was the same. So for example, in terms of levels of education, the same kind of previous job experience, the same skill sets, qualification, and so on and so forth. So the only difference was the perceived race of applicants implied by their names. And then researchers measured how many calls they received for interviews. Now, if racism doesn't exist, then both type of resumes should receive the same number of callbacks, because they have the same qualifications. But if racism exists, then resumes with white-sounding names should receive more callbacks. So this is the result. Now, all combined, 9.7% of white-sounding resumes received callbacks, whereas only 6.5% of black-sounding resumes received callbacks. So the ratio is 1.5. Which means that applicants with white-sounding names are 50% more likely to receive callbacks for their interviews than the applicants with black-sounding names. This study has been replicated many times, and so far, the researchers have produced 24 studies like this, and collectively representing 54,000 applications submitted for 25,000 positions. And on average, white applicants received 36% more callbacks than equally qualified black applicants. Now, interestingly enough, this discrimination in hiring even applies to employers who explicitly say they value diversity in their job posting. So they would use words like equal opportunity employer, or they say something like minority are strongly encouraged to apply. But they still showed preference for white applicants. Now, many people believe that discrimination is declining, but scientific data actually suggests that the levels of discrimination remain more or less the same over the last 25 years, at least at the point of hire. Now, I want to point out something important here. So these corporations and hiring managers are not making conscious decisions not to hire black applicants. They are not explicitly saying, oh, here I have a white applicants and black applicants, so I'm going to hire this white applicants because I like white people better. They are not saying this. but rather their decisions are unconsciously influenced by cultural stereotypes that endorse white people as more competent and more qualified. So it comes from these subtle images that we see that are deeply ingrained in our culture. This is called unconscious bias or implicit bias. When hiring managers see equally qualified white applicants and black applicants, something in their mind tells them, without knowing why, that this particular white applicant is better. This person is more competent, more capable. Hunch, intuition, gut feeling. So that's unconscious bias. When I mention unconscious bias, inevitably, some people tell me that they don't have unconscious thoughts and therefore they cannot have unconscious bias. They assure me that they are absolutely certain that they are aware of what they are thinking and what they are feeling, and their decisions and actions are under complete control. So here, instead of presenting scientific studies that demonstrate the existence of unconscious thoughts, I want you to think about how many times you fell off the bed. Okay, so the question is, how many times have you fallen out of bed? Probably not many. I fell out of bed 3 times in my life, twice as a kid and once as an undergrad college student, sleeping on the top bunk of a bunk bed in a dorm room. When you think about it, it's pretty remarkable that we don't fall off the bed more often. When we are asleep, we are not aware what we are doing and what's happening in our environment. And yet we manage to stay on the bed night after night. This remarkable ability to stay within the confine of a bed is made possible by our unconscious process that monitors the edges of the mattress throughout the night. So we have what's called proprioceptor system that monitors the relationship of the body to the environment. This unconscious process operates even when we are sleeping, and it influences our behavior to ensure we don't fall out of the bed. Now, in psychology, there's this big idea called dual process theory or dual process model. We have system 1 and system 2 that largely operate independently but somehow interact at some point. System 1 is implicit, it's automatic, it's rapid, it's non-verbal, and intuitive. System 2 is explicit, it's controlled, it's slow, and it's deliberate. It is the system 2 that gives rise to our unconscious bias. So now we've established that the racism exists in a society. So let's talk about why it's so difficult to acknowledge racism. So here, I was actually planning to do a quick survey in WebEx, but I just realized when I have a presentation view, I can't really see anything else. So I'm going to actually just skip this process here, but I want you to think about this. So first of all, my question is, do you believe systemic racism exists in our society? Yes or no? Okay. And then I want you to think about whether or not you are a racist. Are you a racist? Now, virtually, no one in this country say they are racist. And then yet many people, well, at least some people, about half the people in American society actually believe that systemic racism exists in our society. So this is a paradox because we have a racist society without racist persons, right? If no one is racist, then why do we have racist society? Now, I'm going to define racist as a person who commits racist acts. And racist acts are acts backed by a set of beliefs that race determines someone's traits and the capacities, and determines someone's traits and the capacities, and it make one's race superior to another. So I'm going to call these hiring managers who chose white applicants over equally qualified black applicants racist. You can be a racist even if you don't intend to be. You can be a racist even you strongly support Black Lives Matter movement. You can commit racist acts without knowing. It's almost impossible not to be a racist, at least to some extent in the US. because racial stereotypes are so pervasive that we can't really prevent them from infiltrating our unconscious. Then if it's so pervasive, then why is it so difficult to acknowledge racism exists in ourselves and in society? Because the term racism and racist pejorative that carry enormous amount of guilt and shame. So it goes like this. If racism exists in a society, I could be a racist. If I are a racist, then that means I'm an abominable human. And just as racial stereotypes are deeply ingrained in our society, stereotypes against racists are deeply ingrained in our society. So being a racist is a debilitating, terrifying thought that threatens our core. Being a racist means that we are not good enough. We are not just enough. We are not moral enough. We are not kind enough, compassionate enough, worthy enough. Being a racist means that we are not living up to our own moral standard. So even some member of white supremacy groups claim that they are not racist. So imagine that it is that threatening to admit to themselves and to the world that we are racist. So we get defensive. But without acknowledging it, we can have constructive conversation about racism. And if we can't have a constructive conversation, then we cannot dismantle racism. So the next question would be, so how do we acknowledge racism? Is there any way to acknowledge it without evoking debilitating fear that makes us defensive? And it turns out the answer is yes. Research has shown that affirming our core values can reduce defensiveness. So according to self-affirmation theory, we are motivated to maintain self-integrity, which is a perception that we are good, we are competent, and we are moral. When we have an opportunity to affirm our core values, then defensive responses that are typically observed in a wide range of experimental paradigms actually disappear. For example, in one experiment, researchers randomly assigned white college students to two different groups. In one group, researchers gave students an opportunity to self-affirm by asking them to write about the most important personal value and then explain why it is important. And in the second group, students did not have an opportunity for self-affirmation. Now, students who had an opportunity to affirm an important personal values perceived significantly greater racism in everyday events than did students who did not have this opportunity. So what this means is that when we feel secure in our knowledge that we are good, competent, and moral through self-affirmation, then we can tolerate threats of racism that we and our society might harbor. We often talk about systemic racism, and it's the racism that shows up in institutions and society. So you can see this in wealth gap, employment, housing discrimination, race in incarcerations. But behind these statistics of systemic racism is individual racism that quietly and insidiously affect our decisions and behavior. These small decisions and behavior can cascade into major discriminatory force in our society. So we need to counteract unconscious bias, and it begins with acknowledgement. So the first thing first, please know that you are good enough, you are competent, you are moral, you are kind, you are beautifully inside out, you are loved, and you are valued. So that's being our conversation racism that we have in ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mizoguchi. All right, well, that brings our presentations to a close for this afternoon. However, we do have a Q&A available now. So if you have any questions, and I already see one popping up, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat for us, and I will go ahead and put them to our panelists for you. Let's see. So the first one we have is for Professor Mizoguchi. Can you recommend some additional resources that further explain the concepts of self-affirmation and also the relationship between implicit bias and racism?
Yes, if there is some sort of the website or something like a Facebook, I can definitely post some links.
Thanks. If you can put them in the chat now if you want to hunt for them, or you can post them to our, we did have a Facebook event for this, and you could post them on the wall on the Facebook event as well, and that would be a good place for it. And I can share it out more widely for the Library and Learning Commons.
Okay, I will definitely do that. Yes.
Okay. All right, so that's one. I'm going to wait and see if anybody else comes up with anything in the chat box. In the meantime, I do have a question. Because it is 2020 and we cannot conclude a discussion on psychology without at least mentioning social media, I wanted to ask you, if you spend any time on social media, what is the psychological bias you see most often on social media this year?
So it's a really interesting question, and I have to almost have a question for you too in response. I'm curious if that stems from The Social Dilemma, if anyone has seen the documentary on Netflix right now. Social media is a fascinating conundrum. Sort of a, so for me, I honestly don't spend a lot of time on social media anymore. I don't have Instagram. I don't have Twitter. I have a Facebook account. I don't post on it very often. And so often, and in fact, this morning I took a screenshot because my friend didn't believe me. I often get an error message because Facebook doesn't know what to do with me. I just don't post anything. I don't like anything. So that's my long answer.
You collapsed the algorithm, all right.
So I don't know if I call this bias, but I see a lot of anger, lots of defensiveness, lots of feeling of threat. I think you see in any kind of topic. I think anytime we get into any sort of slightly mildly controversial topic, then we kind of split into two opposing teams, and then they just started bashing each other. And so Ben talked about how loneliness actually makes the social stress even worse. And it actually makes sense because people are really on edge, and they actually, kind of tend to be like hypersensitive to any kind of issue that they come across.
Okay, thank you. And I think Professor Devine missed part of the question, which was what psychological bias do you see most frequently on social media these days?
While she's thinking, I had one more thought. So I appreciate my colleagues and their thoughts on this. Social media, often we get polarized. We get these two different, we take a side. And I guess in my experience, again, I'm not a proficient at social media user, but I often find that, at least what I've seen, is people, throwing out a comment or an insult or like a definitive position and failing to ask like sincere follow-up questions. So I don't see that often as a medium for open dialogue. Not that it can't be, but it's, I don't know. Any other thoughts?
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute. I think it's a difficult question to answer. I am a social media user. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. But I do find a couple interesting things. I think that the more you like and look at certain things, the less you see of sort of diverse perspectives. So because of the election, I've been sort of, interested in the perspectives of some people who differ from myself. And so I've had to seek them out because they don't show up in my feed at all. And they're really it's sad to see the divisiveness. I'm almost glad I don't see it because I didn't know how much, the election, I'm sure, in particular, talk about polarizing attitudes, right? There's just all of this. And people are seeking, the algorithm does separate us. I agree. But people are now seeking other forms of social media because they're talking a lot about being censored on Facebook and things like that. What psychological bias do we see? I don't know. I mean, I think that what ends up happening, sadly, is that we start to, whatever we believe, we just become more polarized in those beliefs. The algorithm probably, reinforces that as well. But I don't see a lot of people being open to other people's perspectives. And it might be that right now we're dealing with some pretty intense ones, but 2020 in general has been that kind of year, right? I mean, we're talking about BLM, the election. And so I'm not sure how, I mean, the social dilemma did not present many positive, attributes, right, related to social media. And yeah, along this line, Jennifer, with your question, I'm not sure that I can name any others.
Fair enough. All right, we have another question for Dr. Mizoguchi from Professor Coleman. Is there a time that you see us starting to use the term race as one, the human race, and start using ethnicity to describe someone's cultural and physical characteristics?
I think it's a really great question. So sometimes people say, I don't see race. We are all human race. And perhaps maybe 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when the racial bias is completely eradicated, I think we can talk about human race as one. But as of now, and we've been struggling this for hundreds of years, and we individual at the individual level, institutional levels, we've been trying to battle the negative stereotype against stigmatized racial minority members, but we still can't get rid of that. So I think once we have achieved a truly egalitarian society, I think we can talk about human race as one. But until then, I think we do have to talk about race because race plays a critical role in a variety of important domains in our lives.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. With regard to the information on resume bias, would you recommend that if your name sounds like a certain ethnicity that you use initials? Names are so personal, but the professor teaches resume writing and she wants all of her students to succeed.
Yeah, wow, that's a that's a really interesting question. Wow, it's really difficult to answer the question. It's a great question, by the way. So there are many, I wouldn't say hundreds, but there are actually many studies out there. There are some studies that's been recently done. That's where they compare the minority resumes and white versions of resumes, and they've done this for Black names and the Asian names and the Latino names. And when, even to this day, when you whiten your resumes, then you are more likely to offer job interviews. So should we actually hide our race when we apply for positions? I think it's really a personal decision. I don't really have any, right answers for that. So the thing is that even if you hide your ethnicity in your resume, and if you go to an interview, they will find out that you are a member of racial minorities. And then, but you could also argue that if you can get to the interview and you can, showcase how great you are, what a competent candidate you are, then you could actually increase your chance of getting the job. So, that's really hard questions. That's something that we all have to, think for ourselves. Something that we have to grapple ourselves. And I don't really have a good answer for that. If any of you can offer some ideas, I would like to hear.
I think that what's tough about situations like that is even when we look at, companies that employ people from different groups. Let's talk about, just gender, for example. If we start to objectively compare people's performance, I think we still see some of that same kind of bias and discrimination and who gets promotions and how much people are paid and things like that. So, I do think it's a great question. I think you probably would increase the likelihood of, attaining interviews, but I don't know that it's going to solve the larger problem. Because as, Professor Mizoguchi said, as soon as you come in, and they see that you belong to a minority group, you're going to encounter, really similar challenges. And that's sad too, right? I'm not sure that's the direction I want to go in resolving those issues.
All right.
One thing I would add on that is I think there probably needs to be broader discussion about hiring practices and and the way we look at resumes at all. If we've changed the social norm of what is expected in a resume, there's probably going to be more objectivity.
If I could, I would like to just go ahead and squeeze one last question in here. As Professor Devine mentioned, 2020, and the title of this event suggests, 2020 has been kind of a lot. And I was wondering if any of you have any insight. There's been a lot of talk of this year as a sort of collective traumatic experience for people living through it. And can you think of any relatable history event that is sort of similar that might give us an idea of the projected long-term effects of the stress of this year on people?
So I guess, Penny, go ahead if you have one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would not compare. I mean, I hate to draw these comparisons because they're so different. But I mean, if we look at what happened after September 11th, for example, horrible, right? But it unified a nation in a lot of ways. And I'm not suggesting that's what's going to happen here or that it's comparable. Death toll. I mean, we could get into all of that, but I have to wonder if at some level, what you're suggesting, Jennifer, maybe it would create a common experience of bonding moving forward. I don't know. That's a hard question.
At first, when you asked the question, I was like, why are you trying to digress us further? But
I'm so sorry.
No. But then I think that was a beautiful response because I would agree, at least anecdotally. I don't know what data is being collected, but, I've certainly seen, examples of people, some of my colleagues and friends, trying to pull together and do things to support people who've been negatively impacted by the coronavirus and all the implications for jobs. And so I can definitely think of examples where people have sort of pulled together and found a way to support, strangers and, people who've suffered. So I'm going to focus on that for a moment because I like that take on it. Thank you, Ben.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I think on that note, it's a uniquely positive note to end on for a discussion of 2020. So probably that's a good place for us to stop. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our fabulous panelists today. A virtual round of applause for all of you for participating today. And I want to thank everyone who came in and attended this event today. And we hope that you choose to join us at some other Library and Learning Commons events in the near future. We've got another one next week on Apocalypse Cinema, if you'd be interested in joining us. But for the rest of it, I hope you guys all have a wonderful afternoon. And I hope that the rest of your 2020 is relatively uneventful and calm and cheerful as possible this year. So thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.